It's also a confirmation of what the church has proclaimed for millennia, that we are not made to be alone, but we are made for covenant.
Sociologist Dr. Brad Wilcox speaking at this year's Issues Etc. Making the Case conference.
So give today's young men and women the truth that they deserve. Pursue marriage, pursue it with intention, and pursue it in your 20s, when the window is widest and the possibilities most open. The road ahead, of course, is not easy, but it leads somewhere worth going, and you, 20-somethings here, were made for this journey.
You can watch and listen to Dr. Brad Wilcox making the case for 20-something marriage from the 2026 Making the Case conference. For a $250 gift by Labor Day, we'll send you a link to video and audio recordings of the entire conference. Learn more at issuesetc.org. Sad to say, the COVID era will be remembered by some Americans as the time of their life. They got to stay home from work from home, maybe not work at all. They were able to stay isolated, and many of them remain that way. How many people do you see on a daily basis who, for non-medical reasons, are still wearing the masks, perhaps even still doing the 6-foot thing? But for most people, it was a time of deep distress, of confusion, and if we're honest about it, especially with the information that's coming out now, that confusion didn't need to be there in hindsight. Welcome back to Issues Etc. I'm Todd Wilkin. Joining us to talk about Dr. Anthony Fauci's pandemic diaries, Dr. Aaron Kheriaty. He's a physician specializing in psychiatry, a fellow and director of the program in bioethics technology and human flourishing at the Ethics and Public Policy Center. He's author of 5 books, including Making the Cut, How to Heal Modern Medicine, and New Abnormal, The Rise of the Biomedical Security State. Dr. Kheriaty, welcome back.
Thank you. Very good to be with you.
Remind us about the personal cost for you and your family during the pandemic.
So for 16 years leading into COVID, I was professor in the School of Medicine and director of the medical ethics program at the University of California, Irvine. And I made the fateful decision in 2021 to challenge the university's vaccine mandate in federal court. As an ethicist, I thought that the mandate was both unethical and potentially illegal. The court disagreed with me on the latter question, but I stand behind the decision to challenge it on the basis that it violated the principle of informed consent. But if you want to go sideways with your employer, a very efficient way to do that is to sue them in federal court. So the university wasted no time in firing me. So I lost my job. I really sort of lost my career in academic medicine. I had been there, as I said, for 16 years. I had won the Excellence in Teaching Award 4 times as voted on by the medical students. I was, deeply involved in medical education and in the School of Medicine and in the ethics program, which I had helped to develop there at the university. So I've since moved into private practice, and I work for a public policy think tank in Washington, D.C. called the Ethics and Public Policy Center. So my career has worked out. I have more time now for research and writing than I used to. Published a couple of books in the last few years. Since I left the university, I have 2 more books in the pipeline. So, in the end, in God's providence, he took care of me, took care of my wife and our 5 children. But while you're going through something like that, of course, it's challenging. And I still think what happened to me and so many other people during the pandemic, even if we found our footing in the end, was still unjust. I think people should not have been kicked out of school and lost their scholarships. I think people should not have lost their jobs for refusing or declining to take a novel therapeutic that they may have reasons to think was not going to be good for them. So the pandemic cost me my career, and it made me pivot to something entirely new. I don't regret having done that, but I still think there were a lot of injustices committed during COVID against people who were not a threat to public health. In fact, they were raising very legitimate questions, very legitimate issues about our pandemic response, asking questions about whether prolonged lockdowns and school closures were necessary or whether they were doing more harm than good on balance, asking questions about mandating things like masks or mRNA injections. And I think now in retrospect, we can look back and see that that period in our lives was characterized by a lot of weaponization of authority in science and misuse and mischaracterization of science. And I think a man like Anthony Fauci is sort of exhibit A when it comes to how not to lead during a crisis.
So what stood out the most to you about Dr. Fauci's pandemic diary?
So there's been a lot of public commentary on the enormous levels of vanity and susceptibility to flattery displayed in the diary. Fauci's kind of obsession with documenting each and every media hit, each and every celebrity endorsement, the glitterati's parties that he got invited to and the awards that he was given. And all of that, I think, was distasteful enough and certainly important to highlight in a public leader. Good leaders, strong leaders, know that listening to flatterers and sycophants is not a good way to get a beat on how you're doing, that good, confident leaders will listen to their critics. It doesn't mean they always regard their critics as correct or their criticisms to be valid, but they at least take them seriously because those are the kind of people that often tell you difficult truths about yourself that the flatterers and the people who are just sort of using you to get ahead will often not be willing to point out. But to me, I think the most important thing about the diary was not what was present in there, but what was conspicuously absent. Because the thing that was absent was any discussion, any wrestling with emerging evidence or new studies or the latest data to come out about COVID that may have led to a reconsideration of the policies that Fauci was endorsing. It seemed that he decided upfront and prior to any examination of the evidence, he decided what the policies were going to be, what he was going to endorse. And in the face of contradictory evidence, he steadfastly refused to reconsider his position. And so he really wasn't doing science. He wasn't engaged in the kind of openness to debate characteristic of good science. He was engaged in weaponizing science in a form of what I call scientism, the ideological weaponization of science for purposes of exercising authority. And so it was striking to me that the man who was, in some sense, the spokesman, the public educator for our pandemic response during COVID, seemed so little interested in emerging scientific data on COVID. And this is, of course, consistent with the experience of my friend Scott Atlas, who was placed on the White House Coronavirus Task Force, along with Dr. Fauci and Dr. Birch. And Atlas's experience on that task force confirmed, I think, what we saw in the diary. In his memoir, a book called The Plague Upon Our House, Atlas talks about coming to those meetings with a stack of studies and papers, fresh off the preprint servers that he wanted to discuss with the White House Coronavirus Task Force, and basically got stonewalled by Dr. Fauci and Dr. Birx, who seemed not at all interested in wrestling with scientific evidence and instead simply interested in pushing the policies they had already decided in advance, this is what we're going to do.
What have we learned or what has been further confirmed about Dr. Fauci's attempts to censor information that emerged contrary to his narrative during the pandemic?
So, as I said earlier, I was involved in this case, Missouri versus Biden, that alleged that the federal government was engaged in precisely this kind of censorship, coercing and forcing social media companies to do the government's bidding. And what we alleged was essentially admitted a few months ago by the government when they settled the case. And one of the things that we presented in that case was actually an email between Anthony Fauci and Francis Collins. Fauci was the director of a division at the NIH, and Collins was the director of the NIH as a whole. And at the time, two of my co-plaintiffs, Jay Bhattacharya, who of course now is director of the NIH, and Martin Kulldorff, who is now also working for HHS. At the time, Bhattacharya and Kulldorff were Harvard and Stanford professors of epidemiology, and they published a document called the Great Barrington Declaration, which advocated essentially for a traditional public health approach to COVID, where it was focus our efforts to protect the people who are really vulnerable to this illness, which would have been the old, the frail, people with several medical comorbidities, and let other people go about their business, essentially, and not ruin their lives through lockdowns and school closures when they were not at significant risk of harm from this virus. So they were advocating this traditional public health approach that had been mainstream public health, uncontroversial, up until essentially late 2019. And in this email between Fauci and Collins, his boss at the NIH, Collins said, "We need a swift and devastating takedown of the premises of the Great Barrington Declaration." So essentially, we need a behind-the-scenes smear campaign, not a public debate, not a public discussion, not a, hey, let's invite this Harvard and this Stanford professor of epidemiology to the NIH to debate this policy question publicly. None of those things. It was, we're going to smear these people through surreptitious means. We're going to attempt to ruin their reputation, attempt to discredit them. And we're going to engage in, with the rest of the federal government at that time in these efforts to censor on social media where information that we don't like might spread. So this is not only characteristic of bad science, but it's also, well, it's unconstitutional, as the courts agreed in our case. It's a violation of our First Amendment free speech rights. And it creates a climate of fear among other doctors and scientists who don't want to speak out because they know that this is an institution of the federal government that has the ability to punish us if we say things that they don't like. And in fact, Anthony Fauci has a history going all the way back to the AIDS epidemic of basically cutting off the grant funding. And as someone who's got control of the purse strings in infectious disease at the NIH, he can do this. The NIH funds 85% of medical research in the United States. So if you're a researcher at a university or you're an administrator at a university, you know that our research labs and our faculty who do research in medicine cannot survive without NIH funding. And by cutting off that funding, you effectively hamstring the ability of scientists to operate here. And that was deployed, I think, to great effect to silence doctors and scientists who didn't want to challenge anything that Anthony Fauci was saying on television for fear of losing their funding. And so I think I know, in fact, because I've spoken to many of them, there were a lot of doctors and scientists who harbored serious doubts and critiques of our pandemic response.
So what did we learn from the diaries about Dr. Fauci's thoughts on the origin of COVID-19?
So one of the really disconcerting things that came out with the diaries, and this was not the first piece of evidence along these lines, but it confirmed what earlier evidence has shown, and that's that privately, Fauci acknowledged and recognized very credible evidence for the notion that COVID was created through gain-of-function research and that it may have leaked from a lab in Wuhan. And so there was an infamous episode that happened early in the pandemic where Fauci basically coordinated a half a dozen scientists to publish a paper in Nature magazine. It's now known as the Proximal Origins paper. And this paper publicly in this very prestigious medical journal said there's no evidence for a lab leak. There's no evidence that this was an humanly engineered virus. This was a spillover from animals in the Wuhan wet market. So that the natural origins hypothesis was endorsed by these prestigious scientists and the lab leak was dismissed. And that basically put to rest the debates for probably the next year or two. Well, what we know about that paper, because we got on a FOIA request. We got internal communications between those scientists that Fauci had coordinated. And privately, Fauci was not the only one who did this, to his shame, but there were several others involved in that paper who also basically admitted, I think there's more evidence for a lab leak than there is for natural origins. And yet, when they published the paper, it was the opposite conclusion that they presented to the public. So this was one of several examples in the diary where Fauci acknowledged considerable evidence for a position that he didn't like. And at the very same time that he was acknowledging that privately in this journal, publicly he was saying precisely the opposite. So I think we have to be very careful about accusing people of lying. You know, people can be mistaken. People can inadvertently say things that are wrong. But I think this is very strong evidence that not only was Fauci mistaken regarding the origins of COVID, now I think there's pretty unassailable evidence in favor of lab leak and very little evidence in favor of natural origins. But not only was Fauci wrong about that, but Fauci acknowledged privately that he knew the truth, and yet publicly he said the opposite, which is, of course, something that should be of concern to all Americans.
Dr. Aaron Kheriaty is our guest. We're talking about Dr. Anthony Fauci's pandemic diaries. Were masks, social distancing, school closings, worship restrictions, and the general shutdown necessary?
We're going to have to be vigilant on two different fronts. We're going to have to defend the truth about the human person, made in the image and likeness of God, created male and female, created for marriage. We're also going to have to defend our freedom to live according to those truths.
Dr. Ryan Anderson, president of the Ethics and Public Policy Center and member of the White House Religious Liberty Commission, speaking at this year's Issues Etc. Making the Case conference.
Over and over again, we're going to see that we have to form the next generation of our students, of our children, our grandchildren to believe the truth, while also defending our freedom to live it out. And then the long game is reforming our civil laws to reflect the truth.
You can watch Ryan Anderson's presentation, Making the Case for Social Conservatism, from the 2026 Issues Etc. Making the Case conference. For a donation of $250 by Labor Day, we'll send you a link to watch an on-demand video stream and download audio recordings. Order online at issuesetc.org.
Your comprehensive source for information, teaching, and truth. You're listening to Issues Etc.
At the heart of Lutherans for Life is good news. Good news that brings hope to a culture so focused on death. Lutherans for Life equips Lutherans and their neighbors to be gospel-motivated voices for life. Lutherans for Life believes God gives the gift of life to all people, from the moment of conception until natural death. Learn more about how you and your congregation can help bring hope and healing to all the life issues through a wide variety of resources and caring activities at lutheransforlife.org.
Have you ever wanted to enter a program that teaches right habits and intellectual rigor as you apprehend the beautiful, the good, and the holy, all the while learning classical languages and reading classical texts? Do you want to be a classical scholar? I'm Dr. Charles Schultz, the new leader of the Classical Lutheran Education Program at Concordia, Chicago. Learn more about this program at CUC by visiting cuchicago.edu, cuchicago.edu.
Welcome back to Issues Etc. I'm Todd Wilkin. We're talking about Dr. Anthony Fauci's pandemic diaries. Dr. Aaron Kheriaty is our guest. So, Dr. Kheriaty, let's talk about some of the particulars of the restrictions that were in place during the COVID era. Were masks, social distancing, school closings, worship restrictions, and the general shutdowns, were they necessary?
Those things were not necessary. We learned very early on from a study by Jay Bhattacharya that was done in Santa Clara County, California, that COVID was much more ubiquitous than previous estimates had suggested. That, in other words, many people had been infected by this virus, in spite of the measures we were taking to try to stop the spread of the virus. Many people had been infected. Many of them were asymptomatic, so they weren't counted in the denominator when people were calculating the infection fatality rate. That's why initially the World Health Organization came out with very scary numbers that 3 or 4% of people who got COVID were going to die of COVID, which is obviously a terrifying prospect. And essentially what Jay showed, and this was replicated then hundreds of times around the world after he published his landmark study, was that no, the infection fatality rate was less than 0.5%, and that the vast majority of the people who had a bad outcome from COVID were very old and very frail and had multiple medical comorbidities, that people under the age of 65 were not at significant risk of bad outcomes from this illness, that healthy children had 0 fatalities from COVID. But what his study also showed us was that all the things that we were doing to try to stop the spread of COVID were essentially ineffective, that masks weren't working, social distancing wasn't working, that this was going to spread regardless of what we did. Well, this was not something that our public health authorities wanted to hear, because their plan from the very beginning, which they never deviated from, was we need to lock down until we get a vaccine, and then we need to force everyone to take the vaccine. And that's the only way out of the pandemic. That natural immunity from getting infected wasn't going to count. We're still going to force those people to get vaccinated. And so by the time the vaccine came around, most people had already gotten COVID. And the vaccine itself, we now know, did not stop infection and transmission of the virus. So the thing that ultimately ended the spread of COVID was the Omicron wave, which was a variant that did not make people very sick. It was a sort of common cold for the vast majority of people who got it, but that was almost impossible to stop the spread of at the same time. And so in retrospect, we ended up locking down, closing schools, and doing a lot of collateral harm to people's mental health, to people's businesses, to their development for children and adolescents who were in school. And if you look at states that didn't do that, or did that maybe for only a month or two and then opened up, like Florida, and you compare all-cause mortality to states like California, where we did that for several years, the outcomes were the same. In other words, Florida only locked down for a few weeks. California locked down for periods of months to years, depending on the county. And California didn't do any better. All they did was basically cause all the collateral damage that a state like Florida avoided. If you look at country-by-country comparisons, Sweden chose not to lock down and did as well, if not better, in terms of all-cause mortality, in terms of public health outcomes, than other countries in Western Europe by comparison, but again, without having the collateral harms from those policies. So the evidence is in now. We ran the experiment, and we have comparison groups. We can compare countries like Sweden to other Western European countries and see that these policies failed to achieve their stated purpose.
So I want you to speak to it in terms of your specialty, which is psychiatry, about that aspect of the collateral damage to all of the anti-COVID measures.
So my first intervention in criticizing our public health policies during COVID came not in 2021 when I challenged the vaccine mandates. It came a year earlier in 2020 when, wearing my psychiatrist hat, I published a piece in Public Discourse called The Other Pandemic. And essentially what I was seeing clinically as a psychiatrist in my own patients, in the patients in the resident clinics that I was supervising at UCI, was extremely high levels of anxiety, relapses with depression when people had been stable for a long time, relapses with drug and alcohol abuse when people had been sober and stable for long periods of time. I saw that the lockdowns and school closures were causing enormous harms, and I could not understand why my fellow psychiatrists were not speaking out against this. So I was wondering initially, is this just me? Is this just anecdotal evidence that I happen to be seeing more of these cases than other people? But then in the summer of 2020, the CDC came out with very definitive population-based evidence showing, no, what I'm seeing is exactly what's happening. rising rates of depression and anxiety, rising rates of alcohol abuse and drug-related deaths, and rising rates of suicide on top of an already bad situation. So in 2018, before the pandemic, the Surgeon General acknowledged that we have an epidemic of what are called deaths of despair, death by suicide, alcohol-related illnesses, and drug overdose. So this was acknowledged publicly to be a problem already before the pandemic. And essentially what lockdowns and school closures did was to pour gasoline on that fire, was to increase the rates of suicide, was to take alcohol-related deaths were 69,000 a year. Prior to the pandemic, in the first year of the pandemic, that number went up to 99,000 a year, from 69 to 99,000. Those excess 30,000 deaths, nobody was talking about that on TV. Same thing happened to drug overdose deaths, went from 70,000 to 100,000 in 1 year during the lockdowns. And so I was trying to draw attention to the fact that while you turn on the news, you see only COVID deaths, that these policies had other downstream effects that we need to be paying attention to. Public health is not about one illness. It's about the health of the population as a whole. And a drug overdose death, an alcohol-related death, a suicide is every bit as tragic and every bit as problematic as a COVID death. Why aren't we paying attention to those things?
I want to get to the vaccines in a minute, but since you mentioned COVID death, in the end, are we able to trust what the government and other agencies were reporting about the number of COVID deaths? That is, the number of deaths directly related to the contraction of COVID.
We are not, because the government had its thumb on the scales to artificially inflate COVID deaths. The reasons for that, we could get into various speculative theories, but the fact that they were doing that is unassailable, because essentially what Medicare was doing, and of course Medicare is the biggest payer among insurances for hospitals around the country. What Medicare was doing was saying, if someone is a COVID case, meaning they have a positive COVID test, we'll reimburse the hospital more than any other patient. So the same patient, same medical circumstances, positive COVID test, the hospital gets more money. So the hospitals were incentivized to test everyone and to test them constantly. And many people tested positive for COVID without having significant COVID symptoms. Certainly many of those cases were hospitalized for reasons other than COVID. So I'll just mention one example. I was on the psychiatry service that consulted with patients in the main hospital at the time. I remember a young woman in her 20s who was admitted for suicidal ideation. She should have been admitted to the psychiatry unit because that would have been the most appropriate setting for someone who was hospitalized because of suicidality. Instead, she had a positive COVID test, 0 COVID symptoms, and she was admitted to the medicine service so she could be kept on isolation because of that positive COVID test, which was not a good therapeutic environment for a suicidal person. And furthermore, if she would have, God forbid, let's say, taken her own life while in the hospital, she would have been counted under the government's metrics as a COVID death, even though her death had nothing to do with the fact that she had a positive COVID test. We now know that there were many, many, many people who died of other causes that are included in the COVID death numbers simply because they happen to have a positive COVID test at the time when they died or shortly before they died.
Regarding the vaccines, how many vaccines and boosters were in the end recommended by the CDC?
Oh gosh, I think that's a good question. Off the top of my head, if they were recommending them every 6 months, essentially it was getting on into the 10, 11, 12 doses of this product if you were to stay fully compliant with official CDC recommendations by the end of the pandemic. And essentially what we saw with vaccine efficacy was, even if there was some efficacy in reducing the risk of severe illness, that's debatable, it only lasted for 6 months with the first shot. It lasted for about 3 months with the second shot, and it lasted about 6 to 8 weeks for the third shot. So you got these diminishing returns every time you got an additional booster, with, of course, the additive risks of potential side effects with every new dose of this product. So I think the evidence is in for anyone who cares to look that these mRNA shots are really a failed product. I mean, a vaccine that only lasts 6 months is not a vaccine under any traditional definition. A vaccine that does not stop infection and transmission of the virus, that isn't what we call sterilizing, is not a vaccine that's going to protect anyone else. And so the public health rationale that, even if you're not going to benefit, you ought to get vaccinated for the sake of the other people around you, that argument didn't hold water when it came to these products. And this was one of the things that Fauci acknowledged that he knew in his diary, but again, refused to admit publicly the fact that these products did not stop infection and transmission. Because if the public health authorities would have acknowledged that, then the whole practice of bullying people that did not want to take this product, the whole basis for that would have disappeared.
That strikes me as circular reasoning, that we know that they're not effective, but if we tell the public they're not effective, then we won't be able to require the public to take an ineffective vaccine.
I think you're exactly right. What happened during the pandemic was that the public health authorities decided in advance, these are the behaviors that we want the American people to engage in. They also decided that the American people are apparently not intelligent enough to assess evidence and make their own healthcare decisions. They have to be told what to do. And if we leave them to their own devices, then they're going to make the wrong decisions. So instead of doing what public health authorities should do, which is give nuanced and accurate information, updated as new information comes to light, giving accurate information to the American people, updating the American people, letting the American people make good judgments for themselves and for their children, they said, no, we're not going to do that. We essentially don't trust ordinary people sufficiently to make sound decisions. We're going to decide in advance what they want to do, and we're only going to provide information that moves people behaviorally in the direction that we want to go, and we're going to suppress any information that we think might move people in another direction. So it was information control for the purpose of behavioral control.
And all along, I want to point out something you mentioned before. There was sitting there the Great Barrington Declaration that, if I'm reading your explanation of it correctly, simply said, let's address this pandemic in the way that we've addressed every other pandemic and focused on the worst case scenarios.
That's exactly right. And let's acknowledge things like natural immunity, that people who have been infected, if they get reinfected, their second infection is going to be much milder compared to the first. So if you survive COVID, you're good. And we've known this since the ancient plague of Justinian, where they would essentially use people who had recovered from, historians think that the plague was due to smallpox, who had recovered from the illness in order to treat other people because they weren't going to spread the virus and they weren't going to get sick again in a way that would be life-threatening. So we've known this for literally millennia, and yet we threw this basic biological knowledge out the window when it came to COVID. So yes, the Great Barrington Declaration should not have been at all controversial because it was essentially endorsing the public health approach that had been embraced up until basically we suddenly pivoted and shifted gears in January of 2020.
Dr. Aaron Kheriaty is our guest. We're talking about Dr. Anthony Fauci's pandemic diaries. When we come back, how should we understand the overpromising and the demonizing?
The church's music from the 20th century. The 17th century. The 11th century. The 8th century. The 4th century. The best of the church's music from the past 2,000 years. LutheranPublicRadio.org.
Contending for truth in an age of anti-truth. You're listening to Issues, Etc.
This is Pastor Matthew Harrison, President of the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod. The LCMS operates the second largest parochial school system in the United States. What can you expect from a Lutheran Church Missouri Synod school? There's one race, the human race. And Jesus died for the sins of every man, woman, and child from every land and every nation. Life begins at conception. All life is precious from womb to tomb. And every student, parent, and teacher is created in the very image of God. There's right and wrong, and we know which is which from the Ten Commandments. There are only two sexes, male and female. He created them. Marriage is the lifelong union of one man and one woman. There's such a thing as objective, absolute truth, and it's found in the person and work of Jesus Christ and His Word. To find a Lutheran Church Missouri Synod school near you, visit lcms.org/schools.
The Lutheran Church Missouri Synod values all human life, from conception to natural death. LCMS Life Ministry speaks up for life, cares for people in body and soul, and teaches about the sanctity of human life. Learn more at lcms.org/life, lcms.org/life. We're talking about Dr. Anthony Fauci's Pandemic Diaries. Dr. Aaron Kheriaty is our guest. He is a physician specializing in psychiatry, a fellow and director of the program in bioethics, technology, and human flourishing at the Ethics and Public Policy Center. He's author of 5 books, including Making the Cut, How to Heal Modern Medicine, and New Abnormal, The Rise of the Biomedical Security State. Dr. Kheriaty, how should we understand this kind of two-edged sword? On the one hand, the overpromising on all these measures and the vaccines, and then at the same time, the rather bald-faced demonizing of those who even dared question any of them?
Well, trust in public health, trust in medicine was squandered during the pandemic. And if you talk to ordinary Americans, there's a huge proportion of people, and this has been borne out by studies that have been done since the pandemic as well. But anecdotally and based on good research now, we know that there are far, far more people in the United States and elsewhere who previously trusted but no longer trust public health authorities, previously trusted hospitals and doctors but no longer trust them. And, maybe those institutions and those entities and those individuals don't deserve to be trusted anymore, and it's probably going to take a long time for them to regain the trust of the public through honesty and transparency and behaving responsibly. But at the same time, if people don't trust medicine, it could put them at risk when they actually do need doctors and physicians and hospitals. I mean, I've talked to people who are not part of any political or cultural fringe. I mean, they're highly successful professionals, executives who have said things to me like, I never want to go into a hospital ever again. And I didn't feel this way 3 years ago. So this has had, seriously deleterious effects, I think, on public trust. And trust is very easy to lose, and it takes a long time to regain. It's going to be very difficult to regain. And, there's a lot of evidence that public health and medical institutions haven't really yet publicly acknowledged the things that they did wrong, which is going to make it even harder for people to redevelop or regain trust in them. So I think we're at a bit of an impasse where it's going to be very hard for people that publicly did things that were clearly misguided to admit that they were wrong. There's a few public figures that have done that, and I commend them. That's very difficult to do. I think, but the vast majority of people, including people who are still doubling down and defending Anthony Fauci, they're doing that not because he has any credibility anymore. They're doing that because they endorsed what he was doing at the time, and it's going to be hard for them to admit that they were wrong. And so I think it's probably going to take another generation before we get an honest reckoning on what happened during the pandemic. Perhaps the generation of young people who were in high school or college during lockdowns and school closures, when they're, the gatekeepers of society in 20, 30 years, looking back, wanting to know, what did you people do to us? What was my parents' generation? What was my grandparents' generation thinking during the pandemic that they took all of these decisions that were so misguided? I think it's probably going to take that long for us to really come to terms with what happened.
We, at least at this point, know that forthcoming truth is not going to come from Dr. Anthony Fauci. He over 100 times invoked his rightful Fifth Amendment rights when being questioned by Congress. Had he simply said, okay, I am going to tell you the truth, this is what I was thinking at the time, and this is what I said, if he just came clean, how much would that help, not the restoration of his reputation, because that would obviously, and it is already taking a nosedive, but how much would that help people who have passed through the pandemic regain some trust in public health?
I mean, that would have been an enormously helpful and commendable thing for a person like him to do. He seems constitutionally incapable of doing that, unfortunately. It certainly would have raised my own esteem for him, and I would have publicly commended him for doing that. And I think that's precisely the kind of thing that would help people to begin to regain trust in public health and public authorities and science and medicine. But unfortunately, that was a missed opportunity. There's legal debates about whether Fauci could have invoked the Fifth that center around the fact that he was pardoned by President Biden. He was essentially given a pardon that spanned a 10-year period, starting in 2014 and extending, to 2024 when Biden left office. And typically, when you're pardoned, you're pardoned for a crime that you've been convicted of, or at least a crime that you've been accused of. And but Fauci was pardoned for unnamed crimes, essentially given a blanket pardon for anything that he may have done that would have been illegal, that he may have been prosecuted for, which is pretty unprecedented. But even assuming that pardon was valid, there's a Supreme Court case from about 120 years ago, that basically says once you've been pardoned, then you no longer have the ability to invoke the Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination. The purpose of the Fifth Amendment is to allow you to avoid saying something that might end in a legal punishment. But if you've been pardoned, that removes that legal jeopardy for you. And so there have been situations in which someone who's pardoned was compelled then to testify before a grand jury or before Congress or before a court as to, the alleged crimes that were committed. So it's possible, Rand Paul has said, the committee chair has said, he's going to pursue a charge of contempt of Congress for Fauci invoking the Fifth. Whether or not that shakes out one way or another legally, I think Fauci had an opportunity to do precisely what you suggested, right? To admit that what he said privately differed from what he said publicly and to apologize for that. And I think that would have been a huge step toward healing for a lot of Americans. But unfortunately, he chose to sort of double down and, hold himself out as someone who didn't need to even condescend to answer questions about his decisions, which is not the characteristics of a good leader. A good leader takes responsibility for what he's done and is willing to explain what he did and why to the people who are impacted by those decisions.
Dr. Kheriaty, I'd like your thoughts on one of my primary concerns about Dr. Fauci that took place during the pandemic. He seemed, to my way of seeing it, to lack humility. He spoke dogmatically, definitively when offering solutions to the pandemic and seemed to belittle those who would challenge his assertions or offer any other possible solution.
Well, the old adage has it that pride cometh before the fall. The Greek tragedies are all centered around this Greek notion of hubris, a kind of overweening or overbearing pride. And one of the characteristics of that form of pride or that level of vanity is a kind of blindness to what's going on around you, and a kind of blindness especially to oneself. And the utter lack of self-awareness, the utter lack of self-knowledge that is displayed in Anthony Fauci's diaries, I think grows precisely from this character trait, vanity, of pride, of hubris, unwilling to be open to the possibility that I might be wrong. And all of us, of course, can fall into this because we're all human. We're all fallen creatures, and we're all, myself included, susceptible to pride. It is very hard to admit that you might be wrong. It's very hard to admit that you may have made mistakes. And so, in pointing a finger at Fauci here, I think all of us need to keep in mind that we're liable to fall into the same sin. But it's very dangerous to assume when you're making prudential decisions and there's strong disagreement, it's very dangerous to assume that there's no way that you could be wrong. And I think that almost always leads to bad outcomes. And I think Anthony Fauci, from the Greek tragedians to Shakespeare to Anthony Fauci, we have plenty of examples of how this story tends to play out over time, and the outcome is not good.
Dr. Aaron Kheriaty is a physician specializing in psychiatry, fellow and director of the program in bioethics, technology, and human flourishing at the Ethics and Public Policy Center. He's author of 5 books, including Making the Cut, How to Heal Modern Medicine, and New Abnormal, The Rise of the Biomedical Security State. You'll find links to these books and to the Ethics and Public Policy Center on the podcast page for this episode at issuesetc.org. Dr. Kheriaty, thank you very much.
Thank you. I enjoyed the conversation.
Wednesday on Issues Etc., we'll continue our series with Dr. Thomas Madden of St. Louis University on the fall of the Great Republics, and we'll study the hymn, What is the World to Me, with Pastor Will Whedon of The Word of the Lord Endures Forever. I'm Todd Wilkin. Thanks for listening.
Listen weekday afternoons to Pastor Todd Wilkin and guests on Issues Etc. Issues Etc. is a listener-supported program. Your financial support is vital for the continuation and expansion of this worldwide outreach. Our mailing address, Issues Etc., P.O. Box 83, Collinsville, Illinois, 62234. Box 83, Collinsville, Illinois, 62234. You can also donate at our website, issuesetc.org. Issues Etc. is a production of LPR, Lutheran Public Radio.
Here's an easy way for you to help us contend for truth in an age of anti-truth. Subscribe to the Issues Etc. podcast with YouTube, Spotify, and Apple. Just type Issues Etc. in the YouTube search engine and click subscribe. For Apple and Spotify, type Issues Etc. in the search engine, hit follow, and leave us a 5-star review. Help us inform other podcast listeners by subscribing to the Issues Etc. podcast with YouTube, Spotify, and Apple.
For nearly 140 years, the Lutheran Witness has taught the faith, defended it against error, and shown forth the great treasures of the Lutheran Church and biblical doctrine. We're continuing this legacy by publishing issues and articles that help you see the world from a Lutheran perspective and that teach biblical doctrine and show forth the treasures of God's Word. Visit our website to learn more and how to subscribe, witness.lcms.org. The Lutheran Witness, helping you interpret the world from a Lutheran perspective.